Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another NetHope Solutions Center webinar. Today, we are going to be talking about achieving good digital ID at scale with technical requirements, and we're being joined by representatives from ID 2020 and Norwegian Church Aid. My name is Madeline No, and I'm from NetHope, and we want to welcome you again today to our session. Before we get started, let's go over a few housekeeping guidelines for the session. We'd love it if we could keep this interactive. We would welcome you to post your questions and comments in the Zoom chat window for our Q&A session toward the end of the hour. And we will also be recording this session, so look for a follow-up email with links to that recording and other collateral from the session today. And we also want your feedback. Please take a minute at the end of the session to complete our webinar satisfaction poll. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Layla Toplick, to introduce our speakers for today.
Great, thank you so much, Madeline, and welcome everybody. If you click to the next slide, Madeline, I do want to welcome you to this actually final webinar as that's part of the Emerging Technologies webinar series. Hopefully you've joined us in the past for either AI webinars or digital identity or digital currency. If you're new to NetHope's Emerging Technologies initiative, with this initiative, we're focusing on growing NGOs' internal expertise and capacity to evaluate, to develop, to procure, and use emerging technologies in their work. And today we're focusing on digital identity because identity is central to everything NetHope members do. And for those of you who didn't get a chance to join us at NetHope Global Summit earlier this fall, what I'll do in the next couple of minutes is just to provide you with a very, very brief recap of our discussions related to digital identity at the summit, which also provides context for today's webinar. If we click through the next slide, you'll see some of the topics that we talked about at the summit in a workshop that we had on the fourth day of the summit. We had about 4 hours where we discussed what good identity is, why it matters. We talked about some of the big problems that we see in the identity space. Specifically, we have two big problems. First, over 1 billion people lack a proof of identity, which prevents them from accessing basic services. Many of them are children, women, refugees. Second, those of us who have a proof of identity have faced privacy breaches and identity theft. We also reviewed lessons learned from several identity implementations, both foundational and also functional identity. The team from UNHCR identity team in Copenhagen presented their digital identity work for refugees. The International Rescue Committee talked about digital identity in the context of health services, and we also learned about national ID in Uganda. Slides from the workshop are actually available to all of you. They are posted now on the landing page for this webinar, and that's where you'll also find the recording and the slides from today's webinar. During the workshop, we spent some time in kind of a hands-on segment capturing some of the key challenges and began discussing how we address those challenges. So if you click to the next slide, Madeline, you'll see some of the challenges that we talked about and how we begin creating an enabling environment for good digital ID, which Aidan will talk more about, including policies, funding, technologies, as well as having a collaborative mechanism to bring all the key stakeholders together. So as you'll see on this slide, this is just a really brief summary of some of the key challenges to achieving good ID, challenges around misuse and also misuse, challenges related to getting informed consent, both initially and then also ongoing, which is actually really connected to the issue of lack of user ownership of identity. We talked about data privacy and security across all touch points, including collection, usage, as well as reporting to donors. And then when exploring barriers and pathways to scale, many of the NetHope members actually called for more standardization on technology tools to enable procurement and interoperability. And that's exactly what we're going to be focusing on in this session. We'll focus on this last point. So Madeline, if you click to the next slide, ID 2020 that joined us at the summit in Puerto Rico has developed a certification mark and technical requirements, which are essentially a set of guidelines that can help nonprofits and others in the ecosystem evaluate and navigate procurement of digital identity systems. So Aidan Slavin from ID 2020 will talk about ID 2020 certification mark and technical requirements, and also how nonprofits, governments, corporations can leverage these resources to navigate the procurement process, but more importantly, to really achieve good ID for all. And then we'll hear from Trond Are Utle from the Norwegian Church Aid about an example of how ID 2020's technical requirements are being used today in our sector, and what are some of the lessons learned. I do encourage you to post your questions in the chat window. We'll leave 15 to 20 minutes for the conversation at the end. And with that, I'll hand it over to Aidan to share more about the certification mark and technical requirements. Aidan, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Leila. And thank you, Madeline, and everyone who's joined remotely for this participation. We were really excited to participate at the NetHope Global Summit in Puerto Rico a few months ago, and glad to follow up on some of the conversations that started there with this presentation. So with that, I'm going to jump into a presentation that we've prepared on the certification mark. I'll just pull up. Great. So over 1 billion people globally, as Leila mentioned, live without an officially recognized form of identification. As a result, these individuals often struggle to access basic services, including education, healthcare, voting, and even opening a bank account. These fundamentals, they're excluded from simply because they cannot participate in the full identification lifecycle. This problem can really have lifelong consequences. The ID 2020 Alliance was formed to solve this problem through digital identity, and we work primarily in 4 ways. So the first way, and the way that I'll be speaking to most directly during this presentation, is that we bring multinational institutions, nonprofits, philanthropies, businesses, and governments to shape the market for a safe, secure, and interoperable digital ID that is owned and controlled by the user. And secondly, through our Catalytic Fund, we support high-impact pilot projects that bring digital identity to vulnerable populations. And then we use the data gathered from those pilots to in turn inform our technical market shaping and policy-making work. And the third way that we support the ecosystem is through our advisory services, which we leverage to offer ongoing guidance to organizations working in the ID space. And finally, we advocate on a continual basis for good ID globally. But what do we mean by good ID? So core to our values are the 4 Ps, and that's persistence, personal, portable, and private. So by persistent, we mean that an ID should live with you from when you're born until you die, and it should be able to scale across different services that you need credentials to get access to. Now, an ID should also be personal, meaning that it should be unique to you and only you. An ID should also be portable, meaning it should be accessible to you anywhere you happen to be and across different services that you're trying to access. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, it should be private, meaning that only you can give permission to use data. So those 4 Ps really form the backbone of how we view what good ID is. But we also work, in addition to creating sort of big picture mandate and big picture concept around what good ID is, we also work to build granular guidance for the ecosystem on what good ID can look like at a technical level and in practice. So for about 1.5 years, beginning in 2017, the ID 2020 Technical Advisory Committee, which is a group drawn from our Alliance partnership. So I should also mention ID 2020 currently stands at 15 Alliance partners. So from that partnership, we drew experts on digital ID from a technical perspective and brought them together. And for about 1.5 years, they deliberated on what a set of comprehensive guidelines might look like for technical requirements for the ecosystem. And we launched those technical requirements in December 2018, so just about 1 year ago, in order to move the market towards user-centric portable digital ID. There's 2 important things that I want to note about the technical requirements. The first is that they're technology agnostic. So what we mean by that is They don't prescribe a specific technology, but instead, and this is the second important feature of the technical requirements, they're outcomes-based. So they set requirements that dictate what a system ought to be able to achieve in order to be considered good, rather than prescribing how a system should achieve that. So shortly after the release of the technical requirements, which again was about a year ago to date, we realized that we were having difficulty measuring uptake. So we had drafted these requirements, we'd put them out into the ecosystem. We weren't really sure whether or not they were actually having the effect, the kind of market shaping effect that we wanted. And so we set ourselves to task and said, how could we measure uptake? And the answer we came up with was a certification scheme. So what we did is we built out an approval profile, which speaks to certain personnel qualifications that any system should have in order to be considered good. And we use those same technical requirements, plus that approval profile, which speaks to a few other sort of process aspects. And we relaunched them as a certification mark. So our certification mark, which has now been in operation since, I believe, February of last year, of this year, recognizes integrated solutions. And what we mean by that is a digital ID solution plus business processes and a legal framework that meet the technical requirements and approval profile that, in short, meet our criteria for good. So we designed the certification mark when we were kind of going through that process internally around 4 outcomes. And the first important outcome is product differentiation. So what we're hoping is that the certification mark can enable providers to demonstrate that their solution meets the highest ethical standards and technical requirements in the ecosystem. Now, one thing I want to mention up front is that the ID 2020 technical requirements are not themselves a standard. We considered when we were drafting them, joining standards setting groups and trying to push for a comprehensive standard that way. But what we realized was that there were so many organizations who were pushing to implement quickly that it was really important to get out our perspective early and as soon as possible. So what we did was we instead created a technical requirement, which we really see as kind of a meta layer of requirements that pulls in the great work that's done already by standard setting groups and norm setting bodies to offer comprehensive guidance to the ecosystem. And so, the first outcome that we're trying to drive is this outcome on product differentiation to really help providers gain recognition for the good work that they're doing. And that in turn, we hope leads into easier adoption, our second outcome, which is to offer a shorthand to the marketplace so that procuring organizations can quickly scan through a list of recognized good ID providers. And we're hoping that with this combination of provider side and procuring side demand, we can drive a race to the top. So eventually what we're hoping is that the certification mark can create a meaningful incentive for providers and procuring organizations alike to build and implement digital ID programs with user centricity, privacy, and portability in mind. And now one key measure of the race to the top for us, but I also think for the broader ecosystem, is a convergence on technical standards. And so what we're hoping is that we can drive convergence on important features that we see as important for reasons that we can go into during the Q&A, such as interoperability. So after all that, what did the technical requirements actually look like? Well, we went super low tech. We drafted a Google Doc and it's split into 7 sections. And these are what the experts who sit on our technical advisory committee thought it would be important to speak to in drafting a list of requirements. What's on the screen now is just like the top of the documents. It's just a portion, but you can go online, check them out on our website and read the full 7 sections. And those 7 sections are applicability, identification and verification, authentication, privacy and control, attestations and trust, interoperability, and recovery and redress. So what this document does is it lays out the key outcomes that a solution must achieve in each of these categories to be considered good. So to give you an example, one feature of section 4, which is the section on privacy and control, dictates that a user should be able to access an audit log of any activity for the use that they have given consent for their data to participate in, and that they should be able to access factors such as, who accessed their data, when their data was shared, who it was shared with, and that all of that consent should be recorded in one easy to view location. And that's just one example of the kind of outcomes-based requirements that this document speaks to. Now, another important thing to note about the technical requirements, which is that the Technical Advisory Committee set a review cadence at every 6 months. So what we do is we take feedback from our alliance partners, as well as from the broader ID ecosystem. And that Technical Advisory Committee, so that same body, works to ensure that the technical requirements remain up to date while preserving their essential focus on privacy, portability, and user centricity. So similarly, we went really simple on the certification mark. This is just a screen grab of the top of the application form. And I should mention we were really inspired by the work of the Trustable Technology mark, which is a trust mark for IoT devices when we were drafting this. So we definitely owe a lot of our learning to that scheme. So this application form is what we call the primary application, and it's really just an intake form. It's for providers that want to log in and see, is their solution right for certification? So a minute, I'll spend a few minutes just talking about the process and what that looks like from a provider perspective. So once we receive an intake application, we then generate a secondary application for the provider to fill out. And this is just a big spreadsheet filled with our technical requirements plus our approval profile turned into a set of questions. And it effectively constitutes a deep dive into a solution. So once we get that application back, our secretariat, so our core operating staff, reviews, and typically we have some follow-up questions. So we then send those follow-up questions back to the provider. And once we get the provider responses to the follow-ups, the secretariat drafts a recommendation, which is then sent, a recommendation on whether or not we should certify, which is then sent to our technical advisory committee for final review. If certified, our secretariat then works with the provider to co-create a marketing and communications campaign around certification to ensure that we maximize airtime for that provider. So what impact is certification having today? We are currently running a pilot program with the potential for national scale, although it's starting out much smaller with Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and the government of Bangladesh. And in that program, we will be leveraging the certification process in an open RFI, where we're gonna call for identity service providers to apply to provide sort of the identity platform for the pilot. So we'll be using the certification mark in an active and ongoing review capacity. And this is one of the ways that we think procuring organizations can leverage the certification mark to navigate procurement. But I'll go into that in a couple slides. In addition, during that program, we're offering ongoing programmatic and technical guidance. And likewise, and I think this is perhaps the most exciting or the widest impact that we're beginning to see with certification. We certainly are not there yet, but I think we're beginning to see provider-focused market shaping effect of certification. So we currently have 17 applications under review, and though we haven't come out and certified any yet, we've spent the past 6 months or so really refining our processes so that we can, make the best, most meaningful decisions for the ecosystem. Providers have already reported that just the act of going through the certification process has been useful in terms of enhancing their offering and generating greater visibility in the community. So we're receiving good feedback from the ecosystem so far. Now, another point that I want to stress is that the work that we do doesn't just occur in a theoretical vacuum. Instead, we're constantly testing our assumptions and improving and iterating on all of our processes, including certification, based on what we learn on the ground. So as I mentioned at the top of the hour, one key working stream for us is funding and supporting pilots on the ground. So we've currently got 2 pilots that are in operation. The first is in Indonesia, and it's conducted in partnership with a technology provider called Everest and the National Team for the Acceleration of Poverty Reduction, or TNP2K, which is a government agency. And that pilot seeks to utilize user-managed digital identities to improve the delivery of subsidies to households. So the digital ID platform, which was developed by Everest, features a digital wallet in which beneficiaries can securely store credentials, credits, and currencies. And participants in that program can access and employ their digital identities through multiple forms of biometrics on compatible Android devices. So if successful, the project partners anticipate expanding the pilot, both in terms of the population that's eligible for the service, as well as the number of services available through the digital identity. So to scale horizontally to be able to provide access to more and more services. And the second pilot that we're involved in is in the MELA camp. So ID 2020, alongside the International Rescue Committee, and this is, I should say, this is one of the pilots that we were able to present on and that a colleague from the International Rescue Committee was able to present on at the NetHope Summit in Puerto Rico a few months ago. The International Rescue Committee and iRespond are implementing a pilot of biometric secured digital identity platform, which focuses on facilitating more rapid and targeted treatment of chronic disease for patients in the MELA camp. The program plans, like the program in Indonesia, to expand to include all the camp residents and to integrate with existing education and livelihood services. So again, what's really critical to our pilot approach is building a wide ecosystem around pilots that not only include technology providers who meet our requirements for good, but also include service providers to make sure that an ID is maximally usable while remaining safe, secure, and under the user's control. So this is really all to say that our guidelines, are not just created in theory, but they're actually iterated on based on data from our experience on the ground, as well as from our partners' experience. So I'm going to close by talking a bit about how an organization might leverage ID 2020 certification to navigate the procurement process. So during the solicitation phase, so when an organization is going out, sort of looking for pilot partners, specifically for technology providers, what they can do is they can embed ID 2020 certification processes into a request for information or a request for proposals, and thereby leveraging ID 2020 as an external evaluator of respondents. In addition, or either or, a provider can work, a procuring organization rather, can work with ID 2020 to actually craft an RFI or an RFP in accordance with the technical requirements. So if used, if the certification mark or the technical requirements are used, partners can then benefit from ID 2020 guidance during the evaluations phase. So the Secretariat can work with the provider to evaluate responses using certification as a repeatable process. And the Secretariat can work to offer ongoing guidance from a technical or programmatic standpoint. And all of that leads up to selection when a procuring organization could select a provider based in part on guidance that we can offer. So in conclusion, we hope that ID 2020 certification can be a good to the marketplace that can simultaneously facilitate 4 outcomes: product differentiation, easier adoption, a race to the top, and convergence on key features like interoperability. And we see 2 key ways of doing this. The first is working with technical providers to get good ID tech recognized by certification. And the second is working with procuring organizations to help navigate a complex process using a simple, accessible guideline. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions, and I'll pass it back to Leila.
Great. Thank you so much, Aidan, for this overview. We're getting some really excellent questions already in the chat window. Just encourage you to continue posting your questions, and we'll get to as many as possible. So with this overview, and Aidan provided also a couple of examples of how the technical requirement certification mark could be used, one of the things that we wanted to also have a discussion around is how are some of the NetHope members using the technical requirements today. And Trond Utle from the Norwegian Church Aid will be actually representing the work on the project that involves a number of organizations that are based in Norway, and how they've used the technical requirement in an RFP process. So over to you, Trond.
Thank you, Leila, for the opportunity, and Madeline. Aidan, thank you as well for a good introduction to ID 2020. It also makes it a lot easier for me to reference some of the stuff you've been speaking about without going into details of the things that we've been discussing over actually the last year or so. So, hello everybody, thank you for joining. My name is Tron. I'm working for Norwegian Church Aid as Chief Digital Officer, and I'm also part of the Digit Technical Working Group in this project called Dignified Identity and Cache Programming, a route to scale. So I'm going to take you through a few points. Let me just get my slides lined up. First, shortly a little bit about the project, Digit, then a look at what we've done with what's called an innovative procurement process and market dialogue, and then how to utilize standards introducing digital identity in our programming, using also then ID 2020 as an ally in translating our principles to requirements. So shortly about the Digit project. In Norway, these four organizations are the four biggest NGOs, international NGOs, and we've worked together on numerous occasions last years in enhancing our innovation practice and finding new ways of doing both programming and also other types of enhancement to our operations over the years, and also formed what's called the Humanitarian Innovation Platform then as a sort of a collaboration effort or platform. There's no people hired there. It's not an organization. It's just our ongoing collaboration with the projects that we do. And on top of this, we launched an application towards Innovation Norway, which is a state agency geared towards raising innovation, both in private sector and public sector, and also in our NGO sector as well. We got Innovation Norway funding with the 6 million NOK and a 2-year project that was awarded us last fall, started then in December 2018, and it's running for 2 years. So it'll be finished in a year. The partners are Norwegian Refugee Council, my organization, Norwegian Church Aid, then Norwegian Red Cross, and we also have IFRC as the tech lead in the project, serving through Norwegian Red Cross, and then Save the Children as Norway as the fourth participant. Going through the problem statement of what we were trying to attack is the use of cash assistance in usually then refugee camps, and how might identity solve some of the challenges that we see in this work. It's related to efficiency. It's hard to reach certain people quickly with cash assistance, specifically through voucher programs, or, you know, it started out with in-kind and handing out either food or clothing, etc., and then moving to a voucher process where the cash is actually I owe you letter, and then you can shop with that in the refugee camp shop. Moving towards pilots and program now, where we do, for example, M-Pesa mobile money, and then all of the time you have to register people. There's a lot of requirements on the financial and regulatory side for know your customer requirements and anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism, etc. And the accountability side, there's always a registration and of course verification of beneficiaries, the chance that they have to re-register with us for their new project, and of course in either a region where there's been a natural disaster or in a refugee camp, there's always multiple NGOs running multiple programs, so the same beneficiary family or person might have to register maybe 3, 5, 10, 20 times to get access to some of the services they need. And this creates, of course, duplication of services across agencies and a lot of work manually, because we don't trust each other to share. Data sharing agreements is non-existent and will basically never happen because of the risks involved. The data protection point also is about us collecting so much personal data that we really might not need, at least not outside of the initial verification of the person. And so do we really need to collect all that data? Is our solution created for that? I mean, we run typically a process application like a CRM or a cache programming solution or other kinds of systems where where we register way too much data, and this becomes then a honeypot of personal information, where these are also, of course, attractive to people that might try to break in and access that information. And sometimes these are the way we collect data when we sign up people or try to verify people's identities, that we use mobile data collection tools. Excel is a very popular tool in the sector, etc. And then people need to share this, so they email a spreadsheet or they share with the USB stick, etc. So the practice of working with data is in the sector somewhat in lack of a good practice at the level of the do no harm principles that the sector is holding very high. Also, if we give continued proof of identity to, or can help having the beneficiary controlling the identity that they have proved, then they can over time accrue more information, like a job history or an education history, a program participation history, and the way that they then can have financial and social inclusion. And also, if we then turn sort of the collaboration and data sharing question on its head and say, okay, how about we making sure that we can trust the information that the beneficiary is sharing with us, then we could just do the job once of verifying the information, and then if they digitally can then prove to us or to the next NGO that information is sound and correct to a certain level, then the collaboration of data sharing between organizations can be skipped, and you can do it through the beneficiary and the owner of the data itself. This also moves, of course, the focus to upheave the beneficiary to be the actual owner and of the data and to have agency over how that information is being used. So the question then becomes, if we introduce digital identity, can we then add value and yet do no harm? And what we came to is that there's a case then for having a common language and norm when we are discussing and designing it, and finally procuring digital identity solutions, because all these needs that I just mentioned need a common set of ideas of how to, what is good identity? Why would we need digital? What is an identity that goes into, or what's the principle that goes into creating a digital identity that will not just end up being stolen and sold to the highest bidder at the open black market, for example. So this is where the principles of good identity that ID 2020 has been working on for quite a few years early on caught our eye, actually before we even started the project, but having ID 2020 resources whilst we were describing the problem and the possible project in the summer and fall of 2018 meant that we could then have an idea about this is maybe a conversation starter or a normal language that we could discuss around and translate some of our problems into a more of a description of how a solution might look like. And then also, of course, in December when we were, or in November and December last year when we were awarded the funds, it was just 2 weeks after later that ID 2020 released their technical requirements, and we got a good look at that in the startup of our project. So that was sort of a perfect time match. So going into then the way we've run our project so far and what we thought about when we designed the project is that the market is not ready to just describe a solution in a technical form the way we would describe buying a CRM system, for example, or an ERP system. So we wanted to use the marketplace and anyone interested in bringing value to the process into a market dialogue and an innovative procurement model, and having to do this in, of course, a compliant manner so that we could comply with the rules and regulations regarding our procurement processes. So what we did is that we started with information sessions in the beginning of this year, and had then the opportunity for vendors and any kind of interested party to learn more about our project and the problem statements, to ask questions and to learn what a solution needs to deliver on, and had more than 80 participants in these 4 sessions. 3 of them were online and 1 were on site in New York. And I think we had, well, we're all based in Norway. I think we had 10, 15 maximum participants from Norway or the Nordic countries, and the rest was scattered all over the world. Then we had an ask for this group or for anyone to submit a concept note, and then did bilateral follow-ups with all of the submissions or the submitting organizations or individuals that had written a concept note. We had a form for that. It was a sort of a 2, 3, 4 pager of simple description of how they would recommend us attacking this problem to find a solution that was pilotable. And then this process highly and richly informed and changed some of the parts of the, at least important parts of our RFP. So when we were ready to publish the RFP, the concept notes and the bilateral follow-up discussions and some of the ideas that we've also received during the information sessions really meant that we had a different RFP document than if we would just go directly from project start into a specification phase and then to issue an RFP. So this means that our collaboration with ID 2020 actually started early on, maybe just a week into our project, where we discussed and had learning sessions for our part on how, what was the principles, what's the technical specification requirements, and then how can we utilize this as a sort of a dialogue shaper, not having to accept any specific vendors language or normative way of describing what's actually needed for a good identity solution. That was something that we could use ID 2020 as an external third party, not being a vendor, but actually just shaping the conversation around the good identity. And then this informed the entire process during the market dialogue phase, and also bilaterals in the concept notes evaluation phase, before we then changed and updated and issued our RFP this summer. So then we also come back to how do we can utilize standards when we introduce digital identity in our programming, using ID 2020 as an ally in translating our sector principle into solution requirements. The point is that we have needs. What we need might be described as functional needs or non-functional needs. And also maybe we are very, special, but this context needs special things. And truly, if you talk about having a digital identity in a country like Norway or a developed big metropole somewhere in the world, those needs would be different than if you go to a refugee camp or an area just hit by a natural disaster where internet coverage might be scarce or non-existent. People may have a mobile phone, but it's not a smartphone, and they may not have anything at all. What about if I lose my identity or my password? If it's a digital solution, I need to log on to, etc., etc. So all of these things then introduces discussions regarding guardianship or stewardship, and many of these things that we see in that context. But it's also actually covered by the principles of the ID 2020 documentation. And they have both a non-technical approach on top, where they talk about the principles and why it's important to approach it and get it right this time in the beginning, and then supported by the technical requirements. It's more of a hands-on, still say problem-oriented or solution-oriented, functional, not technically specifying any kind of specific tech for it. And of course, then, as Aidan described, the certification mark that takes a manufacturer or a provider through the hoops of actually measuring up and complying and matching their solution with these requirements. And principles. And to us, this has meant, even though we didn't, it wasn't early on in say the life cycle of the technical requirements from ID 2020, and the certification mark also meant that none of the organizations we were discussing with had started any kind of vetting process. So we did not require any organization that was submitting an answer to the RFP to fulfill or be certified. But we early on raised the principles and the way that they're describing these things as, say, ideals and very much aligned with some of the core issues that we are discussing. You know, should we use biometrics at all? Is that to the strength and to the sort of the benefit of an end user, or is that a threat for, say, a vulnerable population like Rohingyas, etc.? So I think I'll stop here, and I'd love for you guys to have any questions to me to answer during the Q&A, but I'll give the mic back to Leila.
Great, thank you so much for this overview of how your coalition of organizations has used the guidelines on digital projects specifically. So hopefully this was a helpful overview of a set of guidelines that ID 2020 has put together with their advisory board that can help nonprofits and others evaluate and also navigate procurement of digital identity systems, which again was one of the barriers to scale that was identified by several of our NetHope members at the summit earlier this fall. So with that, we're going to transition to several of the questions that have been asked in the chat window, and I encourage you to add any additional questions in the chat window, either for Aidan or for Trond. We'll start with a question from Oxfam team, and it's for Aidan. Aidan, on the enhancing healthcare pilot, are you holding the biometric data on the distributor ledger? And also a follow-on on that is, what is the local community appetite for the use of biometrics?
Thanks, Leila, and thank you for that question. So unlike other iris scanning techniques, iRespond, who's the technical provider, the biometric services provider in that pilot, they deconstruct the iris into a unique template that can't be forged or duplicated, and then they generate a 12-digit string of random numbers, which they call a unique numeric ID, so a UNID. And that is what then gets stored. So iRespond isn't collecting any or storing any personally identifiable information or personal health information. The UNID just acts to validate the identity of a participant. So the short answer is no, the biometric data is not stored on the distributed ledger. And in terms of the second part of the question, I think that's a really, really important piece. We are currently, we do an ongoing kind of learning process, as I mentioned, throughout these pilots. And I know that, one of the aspects that both of our partners are looking at very closely, and that we are as well, is, local community appetite, local community disposition towards biometrics. And I will say as well that we have specifications in the technical requirements around biometrics, particularly around bias that can often be present within biometric algorithms. So I'd encourage you to check that out as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Aidan. Next question is for Trond. Trond, how do you manage the issue of GDPR compliance when it comes to data crossing from one country to another, depending on where your cloud is located?
Well, we haven't reached production, so this is only a pilot, but that's actually one of the issues that we've been discussing. The operator of any project might be a local Red Cross, for example, and Red Cross is not a corporate structure with a hierarchy. They're local entities, and then they would then use whatever solution in that country, and the country may or may not allow cloud solution. This is one of our sort of driving points in our discussions on how to drive conformity and openness for innovation in any part of the world is that we ask our government counterparts here in Norway and internationally as well to drive sort of rules where it's possible to use a cloud service across borders, for example. That's not always the case. But going back to the ask about GDPR, GDPR covers European organizations and European end users. So when none of those are there, we technically do not have to comply with that regulation, but we've sort of self-imposed that on us, and handling that as a global standard, or as sort of at least a minimum footprint for the ideal way of handling these things. In terms of how we then design the architecture of a system, that's sort of beyond our scope of this project right now. We're looking to how can we actually go from a registration solution where we actually enter data into our solution, and that's where the sort of proof of identity of any kind of an individual on the outside is stored, to a more individual driven and owned and controlled identity where they sort of keep the passport and we only verify it when they meet us, and then we keep our case data on our side.
Thank you, Trond. And you're also welcome to, if you have any follow-on questions related to this topic, you're welcome to follow up with Trond via email that is posted in the presentation window. The next question is for Aidan. Ed from Plan International just commented on the universality of coverage, and has a question for you. So universality of coverage seems to be an important aspect missing from the principles, unless I missed that. That's from Ed. Why is that? Integration with a civil registration system might be a way of responding to this gap. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first off, we completely agree with your perspective there. The reason that I left it out from the beginning of the presentation is that, we think that the marketplace for a digital ID solutions is relatively young. And so we think that before a program can be scaled nationally, before we can really begin to see kind of universal coverage, we need to thoughtfully be reviewing the risks associated with these technologies and make sure that, as Trond mentioned, we are doing no harm. And so that's why, we don't speak outright to universality. Our aim is not to kind of go in 6 months to national scale, but we are working towards that end. But I think that is certainly sort of core to what we do. And on the point on integration with CRVS tools, that's absolutely part of our strategy. In the program that I referenced earlier in Bangladesh, one option that we're looking at is eventually integrating with the CRVS systems that are present in country. And if you read through those tech requirements, I think one thing that really comes to the forefront is the importance of making down the road integrations possible by designing for interoperability from the start. So to ensure that a technology can scale and that it can move from vendor to vendor. Because one thing we want to avoid is vendor lock and technology lock, because we really see that as a limiting factor when it comes to scaling a project.
Thanks, Aidan. Moving on to the next question. This is for Trond. Tom from CRS just wanted a clarification on what's really driving the need for gathering a lot of personal data. Is that driven by national regulation, Trond?
Well, actually, mostly it's about international regulations and donor compliance, because specifically in cash programming, there's a lot of regulation regarding the financial side of it. So the financial sector, when they do pay or send money somewhere, they have to comply with a set of requirements for actually knowing their customer, known as Know Your Customer, KYC requirements, and also make sure that they don't fund terrorism. So there's counter-terrorism funding mechanisms or rules and regulations, and also anti-money laundering regulations. So that means that both parties in a transaction needs to be known by the sort of the hosting financial institution, and for us then to be able to send money to someone with M-Pesa mobile money or through anything else, then we actually are required to be able to document a certain set of data.
Thank you, Trond. Next question is actually for both of you. So we'll start with Aidan answering it first, and then Trond. It's a very important question. If you can both comment and explain the self-management aspect of the projects that you shared, and how does agency data subjects work in practice? Aidan, over to you first.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question, and it's maybe the fundamental question. And I think that, you know, in reality, we are still learning how it works in practice, but I could give you a concrete example, which maybe could help. So in the pilot that we're running with Everest as the technology provider, they have an app called the Ever Wallet, which is just an app that can sit on a phone, and it's effectively a repository for credentials. So it could hold a credential that says, you know, beneficiary is over 18. It could hold a credential that says beneficiary is eligible for food vouchers. And then at point of service delivery or service access, the beneficiary would display that credential on the app on their phone in order to get access to the service. The kinds of features that we spoke more to in the beginning of the presentation that we detail in the technical requirements, you know, one thing that is really important to our way of seeing good ID is not only that it's, you know, user-centric, but that it's designed in a way that's simple and usable. Many of the beneficiaries that we have delivered programs or are delivering programs for in the field are have lower levels of digital literacy than, say, if we were to run a program here in New York City amongst certain populations. And so I think one challenge for us, and one thing that we are constantly thinking about, is how can we make some of these apps more fit for purpose and more, you know, human-centered in their design, so that the interface is sort of simple, but also achieves all of the outcomes that we're detailing in the technical requirements.
Yeah, and
thanks,
that sort of
thanks for sharing that example. Yeah, Trond, go over here.
I just want to continue, because this is one of the more interesting points in our discussions, also sort of extending some of the higher ideals from ID 2020's work into a practical scenario where certainly people's both digital literacy and access to technology hinders a direct sort of perfect implementation of a smartphone wallet-based I control my data myself scenario. But even looking at a country like Norway, where I live, I do have a digital identity, but there's a full governance model and stewardship model for where my bank is my fallback solution. So if I forget my password, they will just issue a new identity to me, or help me through their normal verification processes of reclaiming control over my digital identity. And what we discussed a lot in our project before issuing the RFP is then how should we then describe the long-term goal in this scenario, because we need low-tech or no-tech solutions also, or at least for a limited period of time or geography, so that people may have to carry a QR code and then verify and prove somehow that they are them. Maybe they can go to a kiosk run by an NGO, so if they present their identity token, whether that's a chip or it's a QR code, or it's just them logging onto something, if they have the literacy to do that, then they can verify that they're them, and then that station, that kiosk, can then allow them to share with us whatever they need to and want to share with us, without giving us the access and, you know, the keys and everything to the locks and everything. But this is a really important question, and we've been driving the point about portability also, the fact that this identity that they then have agency over and can control, even though there's a governance model surrounding it, that they can carry that into the next project and the next NGO or the next service provider. And that's also a key reason why some of the great solutions in the marketplace did not make it in our cut, because we really want to push that point far in our pilot.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to Carla, I believe, for asking that question. Very important one. The next question is for Aidan from Dominic. Do ID 2020 requirements address interoperability with free or open source digital tools versus proprietary tools? So basically to allow NGOs to employ free or open source software tools that can work with a digital ID.
Yeah, that's a great question, and absolutely. We have a section in the technical requirements on interoperability that speaks specifically to the use of open source. I will say, and we certainly have a strong preference for open source tools. Part of our certification review process is a review of, GitHub repositories, anything that's sort of public. And if an element is open source, it makes it way easier for us to complete our review process. I will say, though, that there are certain elements in a solution that it may not make sense in certain contexts to open source. For instance, a proprietary biometric algorithm. And so I think we are not, looking for solutions that are entirely open source, but that are open source in the contexts where it makes most sense. Thanks,
Aidan. And then the final question is really related to the 3 projects and specifically the path to scale. Will these projects be extended to other countries beyond what you shared? Let's start with you, Aidan, and then Trond.
I think, I think yes, but, I'm hesitant to speculate. I think that it would certainly make sense if we see good evidence in the small pilots that we're running that it would make sense to scale nationally in certain contexts rather, and then potentially to replicate that project elsewhere. But I think that, we're really only at the beginning of this change. And so, it'll be slow. Thank you.
Yeah, and for our part, I think a core point about our project is that we did not have a specific project in mind, or sort of a use case in mind where there's a specific location and a camp and funds allocated to be shared amongst these beneficiaries. We started out with the notion about, can it be done to give end users more agency and control, and for that to give value both to them and to the NGOs participating. And so we were able to drive the principles of portability of the identity and how this sort of translates into value for both parties, much harder than if we were to have a deadline on, well, this have to work right now. And we are able then to discuss pros and cons for biometrics, for example, and we can end up piloting without, because we're just piloting to make sure that we can find the most applicable identity solution that can work with any kind of solution. So we're much more hard on the requirements with integration towards other solutions. For example, if the identity component can work with a number of CRMs or cash programming solutions or health programming solution, etc., that's much more important than having the functionality to actually disperse the money with a certain finance provider, for example. So I think the biggest learning we hope to achieve is to identify or to inspire the market to actually come up with these solutions that follow these open standards for at least the passport, so to speak, and the way that we can verify something across tokens that have been generated from different commercial and maybe closed solutions as well.
Great, thank you so much, Trond. And with that, a couple of thanks first to the presenters, Aidan Slavin from ID 2020 and Trond Otle from the Norwegian Church Aid for really responding to one of the asks and discussion topics from the summit very quickly, and sharing some of the work that you're doing. Also recognizing that all of this is still in progress, and we'll probably follow up with additional updates in the new year. I also want to recognize the planning committee for the digital identity workshop that we hosted at the summit. So in addition to Trond, Steph Dean from Medical Teams International and Julia Copey contributed to the planning for the workshop that really surfaced some of these challenges, but also opportunities for collaboration and the work ahead. And thank you all for really excellent questions and engagement in this webinar. Do let us know if there's anything else that you'd like us to cover related to this specific topic in 2020. You can always reach out to me. My email is right here in the presentation window. Madeline, over to you to close out this webinar.
Thank you, Layla, and thank you again for all our attendees at today's session. I just encourage you to please take a moment to complete our webinar satisfaction poll to give us feedback about this session. Your browser will open up the poll after you leave the meeting, and look out for a follow-up email with links to the webinar landing page and the presentation materials from today. And again, have a great rest of your day. Thank you.